When I was reading The Hobbit, I realized that I was having a hard time following because there was a lot of directions. There was a lot of walking north, then west, then east, then south, and I would get lost. I couldn't really follow. There would be descriptions, there would be maps, there would be a lot of spatial description, and I just couldn't really do it. I couldn't process that information. And that led me to realize something else, which is that books will emphasize something. I think The Hobbit emphasized geography and spatial places, spatial creation a lot. Whereas the characters in that book, I think, were pretty one dimensional. Then I thought of when I read Harry Potter, and I was like, well, in that case, there wasn't that much building. It was like, well, we're going through this corridor, we're going up the stairs, but you couldn't really form, or at least I couldn't. Maybe it just went over my head, but there wasn't that much of a building of a castle. It's like we're like this is what we're seeing, but it didn't get the impression that the author was trying to get me to form a 3D model of the castle and the insides or anything like that throughout the book. Whereas in The Hobbit, it felt like the author wanted me to really see everything and to understand what was going on. And on the other hand, the characters in Harry Potter, I think, had a lot more depth to them. But but then, if you read a work of philosophy, like if you read the Apology, then there's not going to be much world building. There's not going to be any characters. There's just going to be ideas. So I realized that books will have emphasis. Some books will be very heavy on dialogue. Some books will be very heavy on emotion and the thoughts of the characters and whatnot. Others will have spatial emphasis. Others, they'll just emphasize ideas. Like maybe there's a character that's just the mouthpiece, and like there's literally like no depth whatsoever. Like it's literally just spewing stuff. Like the whole reason that thing is there is to just say lines. And I realized that some books were a lot easier for me to read and some books were a lot harder for me to read. And I also assumed that maybe the authors, would play to their strength, that maybe the author of a book that has great description has tremendous spatial intelligence, and a book that would have really rich emotional characters with unique personalities and that feel like real people when you read the dialogues would be someone with immense interpersonal intelligence, or that if one character, or if that one book thoroughly reflects the inner workings of a human being, then that author would be very, very interpersonally intelligent. And then I thought that the same thing would apply to a reader. I thought maybe I would have a very hard time reading something like The Hobbit or other books similar to that, where they're describing every minute detail, and maybe I wouldn't struggle so much with visualizing something. Like I could visualize a painting or I could visualize stuff like that, but then I couldn't like form a room and like place things, and like then like the proportions would maybe get distorted, or I could maybe get the room but I couldn't get the whole house, or I definitely couldn't get the city, and then someone would like maybe just do that instantly. But then maybe I could like really like when I read dialogue, I can hear voices, and if I've watched the movie, then I can make the actor's voice in my head, and I know that some people struggle with that. And so I started to think that maybe you could separate books not so much into genre or into plot or into whatever, but into content. Like if one book is really heavy on something that you're good at, like interpersonal interaction, then maybe that book is gonna attract you, not because of what it says or how it says it or nothing, but the fact that there's such richness when it comes to interpersonal relationships. Maybe you don't care about what is happening. Maybe you just like the interactions between characters and how you relate to it. And maybe I would, in the same way that I would struggle to read The Hobbit, I would have a really easy time with something that, I don't know, thinks, makes a lot of analogies, like the way I usually understand things. For instance, when I was in high school science, we were being taught batteries, and I couldn't really get how batteries worked through my head until I compared it to the heart and how the heart pumps blood. And I was like, well, and I started picturing batteries as a heart pumping blood, and then that helped me understand. I was like, okay, so like there's like the negative charge here is like pumping the negative charge here, and then it's gonna like do the whole thing, and then it's gonna go to the others. That's probably not quite how a battery works, but it got me a pretty good grade on that exam, I think. And so the way that I usually approach things when I'm learning something new is that I compare it to something I already know, and then I work out like the intricacies and whatnot, and like I just work out the details. I was like, okay, like the analogy, like I'm not gonna try and make a false equivalence. But so when I read the Apology, or now I'm reading the Republic, I'm having a pretty hard time with the Republic, to be honest, but not for that reason. It's that there's a lot of references to Homer, and there's a bunch of stuff that I don't really know what they're talking about half the time, but I think it's okay. I think I'm understanding most of it. But maybe, like when they're making analogies, maybe I have an easier time than it otherwise would, because I've thought of analogies my whole life, and whenever I'm like debating someone or trying to get my point across, I resort to analogies. So all this to say, I think that books or literature has this component to it where like you could think of it as like an hexagon, or whatever, like a shape where there's like dots, and so if you move this dot, is like spatial, like it goes up, and then maybe interpersonal is like here, like in those like sports video games where like the team is like good in offense, but like maybe it's bad at defense. Then books are sort of like that too, and maybe as a reader, you would find books that you enjoy based on that, maybe based on that alone.